Okay, let's unpack this. If you look at the news cycle right now, I mean, anywhere in the world, you are just inundated with stories of war, political fracturing, fear of collapse. The overwhelming feeling is that humanity is spiraling backward, returning to a state of perpetual danger.
That feeling is so powerful, and it's pervasive. But if we can put aside our modern anxiety for a moment and just look at the raw historical data, the claim we are grappling with today is genuinely shocking. By nearly every metric, when you scale it by population, we are living in the most peaceful time in human history.
That conclusion comes from Steven Pinker's work, right?
Yeah.
His deep statistical analysis.
Exactly. He dedicated just exhaustive research to mapping this decline of violence.
And I know exactly how you, our listener, might feel right now skeptical, maybe even a little insulted.
Of course.
The argument isn't that violence has vanished. I mean, clearly it hasn't. But the core assertion is that the rate of violence, whether it's interpersonal, communal, state-sponsored, has just plummeted over the centuries.
Precisely. We have to confront what he calls the illusion of ever-present violence. And this illusion thrives because, well, while our actual behavior has improved drastically, our ethical standards have risen even faster.
That's a fascinating point.
Today, we recoil in horror at acts like child abuse or domestic violence that were ignored or tolerated or even legally sanctioned just a few generations ago. We judge the past by our present standards, and then we judge our present by our impossibly high future standards.
So our mission for this deep dive is to confront that modern fear by taking a necessary, and let's be honest, a genuinely brutal tour of the past. To appreciate the peace we have, we first have to establish the real baseline of historical violence.
And to do that, we have to look past the organized wars of nation-states. We need to establish the true baseline, and that's life in pre-state anarchy, especially among tribal and hunter-gatherer societies.
And this is where the statistics get immediately sobering. The sources show that in many of these non-state societies, the death rate from warfare often exceeded 500 per 100,000 people.
Which is just a staggering number.
It is. Compare that to the 20th century, which we think of as the bloodiest century ever, where the war death rate was around 150 per 100,000. So tribal life was statistically far more lethal.
It was constant, low-level existential danger. We can look at groups like the Andaman Islanders, who were known as fiercely aggressive hunter-gatherers, but even groups traditionally described as exceptionally nonviolent, like the Semai of Malaya. Even they recorded homicide rates calculated at 30 per 100,000 per year.
Wait, a so-called non-violent group having homicide rates comparable to, say, dangerous American cities during their absolute worst periods? That paints a really chilling picture of what baseline human interaction looked like before states showed up.
And the archaeological evidence confirms it. It wasn't just small conflicts.
No.
The forensic record is stark. We have evidence of widespread cannibalism in human prehistory. We're talking about butchered human bones dating back hundreds of thousands of years. Life before any kind of real governance was simply survival of the fittest, which meant survival through superior force.
We tend to romanticize that transition into early civilization and religion. But the violence, it just became more institutionalized, not necessarily less intense.
Right. The early texts we call foundational are surprisingly explicit about this. You look at the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, it describes divinely commanded massacres, the policy for dealing with certain non-compliant neighboring cities in Deuteronomy. The command is explicit. Thou shalt save alive nothing that breatheth, but thou shalt utterly destroy them.
And it gets into these deeply unsettling details about captives. The texts outline instructions that permitted taking captured nubile sex slaves after certain rituals, shaving the head, paring the nails.
It's a psychological breaking period, effectively sanctioning sexual violence as a spoil of war, and it's attributed to major figures.
And if you think that sort of barbarity was just confined to the ancient world, you'd be wrong. Early modern Europe basically institutionalized sadism.
It really did. In the 16th and 17th centuries, torture wasn't just for high crimes. It was used routinely to get confessions. For things like heresy, gossip, adultery, often not even violent crimes themselves.
The truly shocking part for me is the social aspect of it. It wasn't hidden.
No, it was popular entertainment.
Imagine 16th century Paris with spectators, including the educated elite, royalty gathering to shriek with laughter while a cat is slowly lowered into a fire as a public show.
That casual cruelty is what defined the past. Just look at Samuel Pepys's diary entry from 1660. He describes watching Major General Harrison being hanged, drawn, and quartered. A prolonged, agonizing public execution. And Pepys notes the condemned man looked as cheerful as any man could do in that condition.
And what does Pepys do?
He just walks away and casually goes for oysters.
That chilling contrast. Barbarity, followed by brunch. It's maybe the hardest thing to wrap your head around. It shows this absolute insouciance towards suffering that, thankfully, our society just doesn't share.
Okay, so we've established a horrifying baseline. How did we move from a world of public spectacle executions and sanctioned massacres to the relative peace of today? It wasn't just a collective moral awakening overnight.
No, it was a centuries-long top-down process. The 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes argued that the necessary prerequisite for peace was the establishment of the Leviathan.
The state.
The state, exactly. It must possess a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence to pull people out of that nasty, brutish state of nature.
And the data validates Hobbes.
But hold on, the state itself commits atrocities. Isn't a key criticism that the modern state just monopolizes violence? It makes it less visible on the streets, but it's still there in prisons or on battlefields.
That's a valid challenge, but when we look at interpersonal violence, the data is just undeniable. As states organized, the violence declined. Even in the late Middle Ages, Western Europe was already far less violent than those unpacified non-state societies we just discussed. If you trace homicide rates across 5 Western European regions, you see this steady, dramatic decline starting in the 14th century and just continuing onward.
So organized state power, even monarchical power, acted as a fundamental civilizing force.
It did. The Leviathan provided the structure, and then the Enlightenment that provided the moral guidance that gradually filled that structure, which leads us to the humanitarian revolution in the 17th and 18th centuries.
Right, the next big step.
And that's when institutional violence was targeted. Enlightenment reason and humanism led to the abolition of torture as a legal instrument for crimes like heresy. Just think about it. So many actions that were once punishable by blinding or branding or the stake are no longer even considered legal offenses today.
And this intellectual scrutiny led to the dismantling of practices that had been justified by philosophy and religion for thousands of years.
Most famously, slavery.
Which Plato and Aristotle defended. The Bible sanctioned it.
And it took moral revulsion, driven by mass communication, to end it. Consider the impact of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. It sold 300,000 copies in its first year. That was an astonishing number for the time.
Like a modern blockbuster selling millions overnight.
Exactly. It was a massive cultural catalyst. It translated this abstract moral argument into a narrative that created visceral revulsion in a huge part of the public.
And you can literally trace this shift. The cumulative graph of nations abolishing slavery. It just explodes in the late 18th century. It shows this profound spreading change in moral calculus that would have been unthinkable just a century before.
So we had centuries of steady decline, driven by the state, driven by Enlightenment ethics. But this progress, it wasn't a straight line. The 20th century threw some major wrenches into the system.
We saw significant turbulence, specifically in the 1960s. A major U-turn in violence trends across the US and Europe. In the United States, the homicide rate multiplied by 2.5 between 1957 and 1980.
And this correlates with what some sociologists called a de-civilizing process. The counterculture often celebrated dismantling traditional social constraints. Self-control, captured by the maxim, if it feels good, do it, an assault on institutions that valued foresight.
That seems like a terrifying spike, but the pendulum swung back pretty dramatically. Starting in the 1990s, we experienced the Great Crime Decline, this precipitous drop in American violence.
A re-civilizing process, as some called it. It was a mystery to criminologists for years. But regardless of the cause, better policing, changing demographics, cultural shifts, the effect was profound. We returned emphatically to that long-term downward trajectory of violence.
And equally crucial were the rights revolutions. Civil rights, women's rights, gay rights. These didn't just target social inequality. They specifically targeted institutionalized violence against marginalized groups.
Right, and their success is often forgotten because of what's called mission creep. We focus so much on the injustice that remains today that we forget the sheer scale of the injustices these movements defeated.
You can see it so clearly in the data. The graph showing lynchings in the U.S. dropping sharply from the 1890s right through the 1940s. A genuine victory over racial terror.
Or the data on intimate partner violence. Approval of a husband slapping a wife just plummeted in the U.S. from the late 60s onward, and victimization rates of intimate partner violence against women dropped by almost 2/3 from 1993 to 2005.
And we see the same moral and practical shift with children.
Yes, the stigma around child abuse dramatically increased within a decade. It went from something few saw as a serious problem to something almost universally condemned. And following that stigma, substantiated cases of physical abuse fell by half from 1990 to 2007. The data shows that when we choose to focus on a particular type of violence, we can be really effective at mitigating it.
Which finally brings us to the long piece, governing interstate conflict. This is arguably the most statistically astounding achievement.
It is genuinely unprecedented in human history. We have had 0 wars between the world's major developed countries since 1956.
In Europe since the end of World War II.
Right. And critically, 0 wars fought directly on the battlefield between the 2 Cold War superpowers. Given the sheer destructive capacity developed nations have, this period is orders of magnitude more peaceable than any prior time.
This includes the nuclear taboo. Even when the U.S. had complete nuclear monopoly in the late 1940s, it chose not to use the bomb again.
And that established a deep cultural stigma that eventually made using a nuclear weapon unthinkable, even if the weapons remained strategically viable. That is a monumental cultural shift. The ability of nations to restrain themselves, despite having technology capable of planetary destruction, shows a level of collective self-control that is a profound departure from the past.
So if the decline of violence is a statistical fact, what are the actual engines driving this change? What are these better angels of our nature that seem to be winning?
Well, one of the biggest obstacles we face is a cognitive one. We suffer from what statisticians call the cluster illusion, or a bell curve mindset. We tend to look at massive catastrophes like the 2 world wars and we conclude they're inevitable, part of a cycle.
But statistically, that's just not accurate.
No. We should really see the world wars as statistically horrifically unlucky samples. We see random events as patterns. If a coin flips heads 3 times in a row, we assume the coin is biased, even though that sequence is perfectly normal. We focus on the clusters of tragedy and assume the whole distribution is violent, when in fact the distribution has been shifting toward peace.
It reframes the whole outlook. So moving inward, another critical engine is self-control, an inner governor.
Absolutely. The research is clear. Individuals who demonstrate higher levels of self-control, whether in the marshmallow test or adult surveys, lead healthier, more successful, and crucially, less violent lives. Self-control isn't just about resisting temptation, it's about foresight, emotional regulation, considering long-term consequences.
And this feeds directly into the power of reason. The Enlightenment idea that reason, when applied universally, forces mutual unselfishness. If I have to argue for my interests in a way that's logically consistent, I can't just privilege my own interests over yours without abandoning reason.
That's the engine of the expanding circle. The idea that once reason is applied, it forces us to apply moral consideration beyond our immediate tribe or family. And there's evidence that we're getting cognitively better at this kind of abstract thought.
You're talking about the Flynn effect, the rise in measured IQ scores over the last century.
Yes. And the gains aren't primarily in factual knowledge, they're concentrated in abstract reasoning skills, like solving puzzles. This suggests we are evolving cognitively into an environment that rewards complex, abstract thought. And when people are better at that, they're better at grasping the universal moral arguments that underpin humanism and conflict resolution.
And finally, there's the powerful force of feminization.
The data consistently show a strong correlation between societies that treat women better and societies that have lower levels of organized violence. This suggests that feminization helps move a society away from a culture of manly honor, a culture that values violent retaliation, and towards one that prioritizes negotiation, compromise, and stability.
So what does this all mean? The decline of violence is a statistical reality. It's driven by these powerful forces: the Leviathan, commerce, feminization, reason, empathy.
But the tension remains. When conflict does erupt, how do we end it? We often hear the slogan, if you want peace, work for justice. And that's emotionally satisfying.
But the analysis of successful conflict resolution suggests we have to be more pragmatic than purely moral.
Absolutely. Research, especially after devastating civil wars, indicates that successful reconciliation often requires compromising full retributive justice for the sake of social peace. This often means controversial measures like amnesty. It's a bitter pill, but people, disturbingly, seem to tolerate a lot of lingering injustice if it guarantees an end to existential conflict.
Which brings us to a final, provocative thought. It comes from the late Israeli novelist Amos Oz. When facing a seemingly intractable human conflict, something messy, frustrating, devastating, He's suggested choosing a Chekhovian resolution over a Shakespearean one.
A Shakespearean tragedy always ends with the stage strewn with dead bodies. It offers a satisfying but abstract justice. A Chekhovian resolution, though, ends with everyone, quote, disillusioned, embittered, heartbroken, disappointed, absolutely shattered, but still alive. The real work of maintaining the long peace, it seems, is accepting that compromise is frustrating and imperfect and messy, but it is the only way to ensure ongoing survival. Something to mull over as you navigate your own conflicts this week.